Alrighty, so in this video we're going to be covering a few just very early and basic things. So this will kind of lay the groundwork so you can understand what's going on or at least be able to follow along. Now I've already made a first part to this series, the introduction. I'm going to go ahead and add this video in, so I suggest if you're very new, like a true beginner, watch this one first and then go watch the introduction. That way, things in the introduction video will make a little bit more sense, since I know some people, they kind of struggled a little bit than told. So in this video, we're going to be covering basic data types such as integers, floats, booleans, strings, etc. We're going to be going over arrays and how we can select elements out of those arrays that we want. Then in the next portion, well, after same video, we're going to be going over classes, how they work, public and private variables in those classes, and what are functions and how they work. We're also going to be going over how functions and classes can differ and interact with those private variables. So for the first portion, we're going to go ahead and load up our Dayz tools in the workbench. Go to editor, script editor. Now file, open file. I have already made just a little blank file just for the very first portion of this video, but we're also going to be looking into the init.c for our examples. So for now, we're going to be looking at blank and going over various variable types. So first thing, just so I can bring it down nice, we have just a normal integer. Now integers hold variables. They can be negative numbers such as negative 1, 2, 3, positive numbers such as 1, 2, 3, 1 million, so on. But the difference is between integers and floats, while they're both numbers, integers cannot have a decimal point. So they are strictly 1, 2, 3, 4. They can't be 1.1, 2.2, 3.3, 4.4. Now with floats, that you are able to use a decimal. So if you have very fine values like that some functions will take in as a parameter, you can do things such as 1.1, 2.2, 3.3, 4.4, and means like that. So those are those two main. Now when we get onto booleans, think of those like a switch. So either it's on or it's off. So for example, I use the name am I on, and I set it to true. So we can use those as control variables too. So if let's say this situation happened, we may want to set a value to true. So when it runs again, we can check it and handle whatever we want carefully, however we want it. And when we get onto strings, think of those as like a message. You can write whatever you want, and generally anything you see inside of 2 quotation marks, that's going to be a string. So this is useful if you want to pass a message to the player or something like that. So let's say they enter a safe zone and you want to indicate that they've entered the zone. Well, you can just simply make a variable that holds strict message of hey, then you can get the player's name, you have entered the safe zone, or same thing for exiting and so on. So those are the basic data types. Now when we get to arrays, they're really the same thing. They're just one variable can hold many of that specific type. So we have a tint array. That's going to be just an array of integers. So you can see here, my int array holds the values 4, 8, and 12. And they're strictly ints. You cannot put a float in there, you cannot put a boolean, not put a string in there. Now if we go over to my float array, we have values 4.6, 8.5, and 12.8. Now these you can add just a normal integer in there. So 5 for example. Now when we get on our boolean arrays, same exact thing. It's just an array of booleans. We have true, true, and false. Now for the string array, we have 3 strings. One that says this, second one that says is, last one says my message. So you have all these stored in a single variable, but thankfully you have easy access to them. So I want to give you an example. Let's say we have, all right, so we have strings that we use for class names. So let's say you have a vehicle. You have 4 wheels on the vehicle. So therefore you need to the create attachment function 4 times for the wheel. And then let's say you wanted to add another component to it, such as a battery. Well, you could have an array of strings, and let's say this first string was the class name for the wheel, second string was the class name for a wheel, third string was the class name for a wheel, fourth string was the class name for a wheel. Then when we get onto the fifth string, we can add the class name for the battery. Now we can go through each element of that array and simply add them to the car. So just for example, I'll show you how to access this. So if we want to access just that very first string, we can do string my selection equals my message array. Now in these square brackets, this is where you put the element that you want to grab. So starting at 0, 0 would be this, 1 would be is, and 2 would be my message. So if we want to grab this, we would simply do 0. And now my selection holds this. It's really quite simple. So back onto that explanation, you can use a for each as well, but just I just personally prefer for loops. Just ignore what I'm doing for now if you know what's going on. So what this is going to do, it's going to run a loop. So that means it's going to run once, all the code that goes inside of here. Then it's going to run twice for that. Then it's going to run again for the very last element, since the condition is while I is less than the size of the array, or the amount of elements that are in the array, which is this 1, 2, and 3. So 3. So with it being less than and starting at 0, it goes from 0 the first run, 1 is the second run, 2 is the third run. So therefore it's only running 3 times. So if we want to add those car parts, we could, or go through the array, we can simply do, well, this isn't actually how you type it, but add part. Now let's say it takes in a parameter of whatever this string array is. We would do my message array, and we would set the slot, or the element, to equal I. And since I changes each time the loop runs, starting at 0, then 1, then 2, we would first add the part this, then we would add the part is, then we would add the part my message. So that's how you can increment through arrays, and it's the same for booleans, the floats, just any array, any type. Part 2, we get on to classes. Now as you will see here, actually you won't see because this is single player offline version. Classes, when you make a class and you want to use the class, you create what is called an object. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and create a simple class here. A class, just call it my class. Okay, don't know why that came up. So when we do my class, go ahead and create just a quick function. What we do is my class object equals new my class. So what we've done is we create a class, now we create an object for that class. So anything that we put inside of this, we can access through my class object. So let's say we have a function that we run, and call it void add health. I guess that's one way to put it. So let's say we want to add health, just as hypothetical, or access that function. We would do my class object dot add health, and it would access this function for us and run whatever code is inside of here. And it's the same thing for if you want to do another one, something that returns something. We can do bool did add health. If it did add health, it would just return true. So we can do bool as added health. We're going to set that equal to my class object dot did add health. So it's going to call this did add health function, run whatever's code inside it, and with our checks, let's say it did add our health, it would return true. So now as added health is now equal to true because this is the return value. So as for private and public variables, I'm trying to think of a way to explain it. So think of a public variable as just a normal variable. Make one int my number. We're going to set it to 5. So all we have to do to access this variable my number is do my class object dot my number. Make a stored in a variable my or int my num. So now my num is equal to 5 because my number is equal to 5. So we can access this variable anywhere we want. We don't have to do anything special. As long as we go through the object, we would have access to the variable. So let's say, what if we made it private? If I can spell it. So now my number is private. Now if we try to run this code here and set my num equal to my number, which is 5, we're going to have a little bit of an issue. Because my number is with it being private, we cannot access my number from outside of this class. So the only things that can access my number are the functions that we have inside of my class. So if we wanted to access my number, we can do int get my number. This is for example. We would have to call the function get my number. So my class object dot get my number. Now it's going to return the value of 5, which is my number, and store it in my num. Now you generally do this with things that you don't need access to or don't want to have access to outside of the class. So for example, if you have let's say you have a class that sets up your player's gear when he spawns or when the mission first loads, whatever, you would have I'll talk about constructors here in a second. You would have a function that you pass in your player object to, and then inside of this class, you would have a private variable, player base, or my player. Let's say this is the variable or the function that we call. We would do my player, player. Pass parameter is player base, player. So when we call this add health function, we would send in our player as a parameter. Then we would take my player and make it equal to the player that we passed in, which would be ourselves for this example. So now that we've done that, we can access my player from anywhere inside this class. Let's say we wanted to add shoes to the player. Just do my player dot add shoes, whatever the actual name would be for a function for adding shoes. But you could not access my player by doing my class object dot my player and then doing it that way. So Now what we just done, let's talk about parameters a little bit. So as you can see, I have this add health function. So hypothetically, we're going to player dot add health, even though actually that is partially right. Then it just 100, for example. So we have our add health function. So what we can do is, let's say we have our player here. So this is us. And we want to pass that into the add health function so that we ourselves can have our health right back to 100. What we would do is my class object dot add health. Now in these opening and closing parentheses, we would add our parameter, which is the variable we want to pass into the function. In our case, it's player. So we just type player. Player gets sent to this function here, which is also named player. Then we take player, we add health to it. So hopefully that was clear enough to explain. Now, this should be the final thing we go on for classes. That's going to be constructors. So a constructor, we're actually going to do the exact same thing, but through constructors. So now constructors, they, to put it simply, they run whenever an object off of the class is created. So on this line here, we create my class object. We created my class object, a constructor is going to run in any of the code that is inside of it. So think of it like a normal function. So we would do make a constructor, we make it a function essentially that is the name of the class. So we're going to do void my class. Let's say there's code in here. We created my class object with this specific line here. All the code that's in here is going to run. So let's say we wanted to add health. Well, we need to make it take in a variable just like we did before. We're going to do player. So player base being the type, player. Now we want to add health to it. So player dot add health 100. Oops. Okay, so remember what I just mentioned about parameters. Well, this takes in a parameter that we have to pass in player. So remember, this is being us. We're going to pass in player to it. So now, once we created this object off of my class, it's automatically, without us calling any other function or anything like that, it's automatically going to run this constructor that is highlighted and add health to the player that we passed in ourselves. Do that. Okay, functions. This right here, that's a function. So let's go to our int c. We have void main. That's literally our main function. This is going to run when the mission starts. Or if you're familiar with other programming languages like C++, you always have a main function. That's kind of what kicks off and starts the actual program. It's what sets everything up to literally run. So just remember that about main. So let's say we want to make a function, my function. Let's say this is our main function here. So let's say we want my function to run. All we have to simply do is my function, opening, closing parentheses. You simply type the name of the function, give it its opening, closing parentheses, and end the statement with a semicolon. That's all you have to do to call it. And it takes in parameters the exact same way as the functions inside the class did. Same thing with the constructor. So if we want to, a number, int my num equals 5 or 56. We're going to pass in my num to the function int my, or we'll just do num. Now num is in this function. Now let's take it a little bit of a step farther. Add health. So we're gonna take my num, pass it into my function. Then my function is going to take it and pass it greater plus, yeah. We're going to call the add health function. Damn it. And pass num into it. So it's going to add health of whatever num is. So we're going to make add health take in 2 parameters, int health amount. And we're going to call it. So my class object dot add health takes in 2 parameters, player and num. And for this, we're going to do health amounts since that's the integer we're passing in. So to start from square one, we create a variable called my number. We're going to call our my function, pass in my number to it, which is 56. In our function parameter, we have it's 56 stored in num, so num can be accessed inside this function. We're going to just have our player ourselves. We're going to create our class object. Nothing's going to happen when we do this because we do not have a constructor anymore inside of my class. And we're going to call the add health function in my class using the my class object. So my class.add health, it takes in 2 parameters, the player, which is us, and num, which is 56. So when add health runs, it's going to see that we're going to be using the player, which is us, the parameter that was passed in. We're going to be adding the amount 56 to our health, which is int health amount that was passed in. So create 56, pass 56 to my function, pass 56 to add health function, use 56. That's one way to kind of look at it and follow. Now, you should be able to have a general grasp and understanding, just kind of an all-around basis to understand what's going on, because we will be using classes a lot in the tutorials, along with functions, various types, and arrays. So that should give you a nice base to work with.